Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another panel discussion roundtable live stream with Saving Elephants about MAGA mayhem, whether or not we're witnessing the beginnings of the crack-up of the Trump coalition. I have with me four distinguished panelists, all of whom have been on the podcast before with us. I will introduce them in no particular order, although, no, I'm going to start with Ryan. Ryan Rogers, I'm going to start with you because you and I are in the same boat here. We are representing ourselves, if you will. I, of course, Saving Elephants. You have an excellent show, Reality Therapy. I had the good pleasure of being on your show once before. I highly recommend it. And I think, what have you passed 900 videos at this point on YouTube?
I think so, yeah.
That is ridiculous. But half of them might be of me because I noticed on Twitter of late, every other minute, there's another one of a little clip of me out there. I appreciate the exposure. But I'm introducing you first, Ryan, because I want to give the caveat out of the way for the remaining three panelists, which is they in no way represent the organizations or the individuals they are a part of. They're just here on their own volition of just speaking for themselves. Destry Edwards, who was on a recent podcast in which we spoke about the extremely controversial topic of Chester A. Arthur. We're not going to get into anything nearly that electrifying tonight. But Destry, you, of course, work at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and it is always good to speak with you. Thank you so much for hanging with us tonight.
Good to be here.
And Scott Howard, of course, no stranger to the show, although I don't recall if the last time you were on, Scott, you had this designation. You are now the legislative aide to John Albert, a House member in the state of Florida. Good to have you back.
Yes, sir. That is new.
Awesome. And last but certainly not least, my oldest acquaintance and friend on this group, Christopher Chesny. We go back to Tulsa, Oklahoma, back when you lived here. You're in D.C. at the moment, working for a number of undisclosed interests and organizations there, if you will. But I know you've had a long, sordid history of campaigns and not-for-profit groups, and it's always interesting to talk to you, see what you're up to lately, Christopher.
Glad to be able to be back on. I hadn't been on in I think I did two of your podcasts fairly close together, and then I hadn't been on anything, I think, since right around just after the election, late last year, early this year. So
it has been it's been a minute. It's been a minute. I'm glad to have you back. I have the good problem of having far too many people to invite on. And so I have to try to pick and choose who would be good for this sort of conversation. I think all four of you gentlemen are going to have good thoughts this evening. The topic, of course, is about MAGA, Trump, whether or not we might be witnessing the beginning of the end. Now, I want to start with my priors, and any of you are welcome to disagree, but I am not of the opinion we're witnessing like some major fracturing at this moment. I mean, I certainly remember, I think the first I remember this was back in the 2016 campaign when Trump had made the disparaging remarks about John McCain. I prefer people that aren't captured. That's who you consider to be hero. There are a number of people who, even to this day, will say that was the moment I was convinced it's over for Trump. There's no possible way he can win this primary. Of course, he goes on to win it. Then he becomes president. Then he comes back a second time and becomes president. And I have too many to list instances over the past 8+ years of individuals saying this is it. He's gone too far this time. He has finally gone, so far the entire base is fracturing. So I want to be careful to set expectations. I'm not saying that's what's happening. I am wondering, what are we witnessing here? This is his second term, presumably his last. And there's going to be something after Trump. And I think he's assembled here a coalition of various interest groups that, while they do have some similarities, very clearly have a lot of disagreements within this group. And we occasionally see these fractures, like we saw with the bombing of Iran, like we saw with Jeffrey Epstein. And so I'm just kind of opening this up for a general topic at first. Before I turn it over to our panelists, I do want to remind our listeners, our watchers, this is a live stream. Feel free to post any question or comment, providing it's appropriate. I'll be happy to share it and we can discuss it here. But with that, I'm just going to turn it over to you guys. What do you think about that? Are the fractures beginning to show, or is that overblown?
I'll start. Something I try to keep on top of this from the polling perspective, so the quantitative side as well as the qualitative, from seeing some of the right-wing discourse on Twitter and a few other different places. And it's The quantitative, especially because literally just this week, what's his face? Silver. He runs Silver Bulletin now. Nate Silver. He just did a quantitative analysis on the influence of Epstein, on top of One Big Beautiful Bill and a little bit of the stuff with Iran. And he said that it's him and most of the other pollsters that have been tracking this say that it's on the lower tier for where it's dividing people away. Now, on the from what I'm seeing qualitatively, and you could see it most notably in Congress, most notable with especially Marjorie Taylor Greene. Massey was never on board with most interventionism, along with Rand. They're last two old school libertarians in Congress now that Amash is gone. There is a small, but depending on state, significant subset. You could cap it at 5-10%. And there is some overlap with that part of the coalition that was generally, if not low information voter, low turnout, even if they know what's going on because they didn't feel that they were represented. That chunk of the base, I feel, or I have heard from them, seems to be distancing themselves in light of Iran and everything with Gaza now. This is their words, not mine. I personally am indifferent to moderately supportive of most of the stuff with Israel because I don't see the upside with I don't see the upside of going all in with the Palestinians when not even the Arabs are siding with them at this point, the other Arab states. There seems to be a flaking off. I would definitely not say it's splitting in two, but I would say a flaking off of about 5 to 10%, especially of the people that haven't been consistently voting, who did come out in droves this cycle and also had, to a lesser extent in 22, but even in 20, who are in and feel like they've been sold out. And so they're pulling away. That said, that could be a decisive factor in some of the swing states, but I would not go so far as to say it would affect the main body of MAGA at this juncture in time. That's my assessment.
Appreciate that. What say you other gentlemen?
I agree with what Christopher said there, and I wanted to add to that. I think what makes this conversation unique in relation to Trump is that if we were talking about any other president, this would not seem surprising, in that every president who gets elected governs to a smaller portion of the coalition than what got them elected. You cannot govern to 100% of your voters because in every winning coalition, there are going to be internal contradictions. And once in power, you have to actually decide how you're going to address those, like which side you're going to take, right? And Trump 1.0 was unique insofar as that he didn't really have a vision. His first term didn't have a clear vision, so he didn't see this sort of coalitional friction the first time around. But this time, and it's weird to say about Trump because he's so impulsive and changes his mind and stuff, you can sort of see a coherent governing idea starting to coalesce. And as that hardens, there are going to be people who, as Christopher says, flake off because they've been left outside, right? I think that's true of any president that's elected. It just what makes Trump unique is that he is usually outside those general parameters. So the fact that this iron law of politics applies to him as well has made it seem surprising.
Yeah. So Josh, continuing off of how you framed the question, there's definitely been lots of things that along Trump's presidency, his time in politics, that you would think this might be what can kind of fracture his base. I'm not convinced this is the red line, although it's certainly surprising, particularly with Epstein, how there's been dissent. But I don't think that Trump is losing his base over this. What I think is interesting to look at instead, though, as part of that, is how this affects his grip on Congress, because he is very willing to throw around his weight in different congressional races and different Senate races. If he said, this Tom Tillis retiring because he voted against the one big beautiful bill. But if members of Congress see that their constituents don't side with Trump on Epstein, and we've kind of been seeing that, particularly in the House, and that's why things kind of shaped up with recess starting when it did in the House, because Johnson was seeing that things were getting a little bit out of hand with that. Because of that, congressmen can choose to side against Trump on an issue like this, because they see that there is some breaking of the base on a particular issue. Not that they're abandoning Trump as a whole, but they're abandoning him on a particular stance.
Right.
It's a pretty odd coalition when you look at it. There's the usual suspects of like libertarians and conservative Christians, and you've also got this kind of new populist element. But I've also seen radical gender critical feminists siding with Trump and MAGA for like basically single issue voters on the child gender transition topic. So every other issue they would side on the left, but they crossed over the line for this issue specifically. And there's a lot of issues, men that didn't like being demonized, and people pushing back against kind of the culture war excesses on the left. And kind of once you actually have to rule, like Scott said, like you're going to piss off someone. You can't make everyone happy. Something that I think is really odd to say this about a Republican politician, but Trump was kind of punk rock. You see rappers and athletes doing the Trump dance. He's kind of the twisted sister, stick it to the man. We're not going to take it. That's kind of what Trump symbolized. Well, now he's in power. Now he is the man. Mm-hmm. And I think you have some a different standard for someone who's fighting against the system compared to someone who is the system. I would say the coalition could hold under two circumstances. If the economy stays good, I think everybody's going to stay on ship. And the other one, I think a lot with the way the Democrats are right now are just not appealing. I think if they had someone who was like pretty appealing, that I think could win people back over who were naturally their contingent, I think that could stir up some more fracturing.
Ryan, I am with you on that latter point, and I was just thinking I don't do a lot of current events, mostly because these days the moment you finally get something out there, it's no longer current. And it occurred to me, like, even to have these conversations, when I kind of thought about this, I'll have this conversation. It was going to be all about this Jeffrey Epstein stuff. And it's still relevant, but it almost feels like old news. And now we're talking about, how do you even pronounce her name? Sydney Sweeney or something to that effect. For those of you blessedly who don't know, I don't know that I need to enlighten you. It's just the nonsense, that takes place in the online these days. But it's funny to me because I'm thinking exactly what you are, which is like in a vacuum of like the left, if it would just stop going nuts, you would think these things might actually have a better fracturing. But for those disaffected men who feel like the left or the Democrats or the radical wokists have been against them, where are they going to go? I mean, they're going to stick with the very group that is sticking it to the left, if you will. And it's part of the stupidity of our polarization in the age we live, right? That it's everything has to have two sides, and so I have to side with the person who hates the side that I hate. The reason I'm saying that way is because it seems to me that it's putting a cap on the very natural flow in a democratic process of coalition building. These things do fracture and they move, they bend and they adapt over time, but we've almost put like this lid on it. These fractures are still here, but they're not allowed to express themselves in a healthy way because you have to get funneled into, team A or team B. And so it that could break down a couple of ways. One is that the whole thing could blow up at some point, and just everything gets reorganized quickly. Or maybe we'll switch back into some sort of a healthy democratic back and forth like we're more used to. I'm not sure, but I did want to. I have a comment up here from Alt Monarchist, so I'm not sure. Trump had a vision; he just didn't have the guts to pull it through. I'm not sure what he's implying that vision was necessarily, but what do you gentlemen think of that?
Well, I think he's responding to my comment that Trump 1.0 was less sort of coherent in comparison to what you see today, and I think it's true that he had some kind of vision. I don't know if it was really well defined, and I think it was cut against by the fact that he staffed his administration with a lot of old guard GOPers, because that was just who he had on hand. And that's part of the reason you see so much more friction within what we consider MAGA today, is that the administration actually looks like Trump. Right? The people he's surrounded himself with, people he's appointed, actually look like what you consider a MAGA Republican, as opposed to the old guard that he had in 2017, 2018, 2019.
Well, and so, Scott, let me ask then, because Trump 2.0 has a vision, can mean two different things. One can be that Donald Trump himself, having 4 years to reflect, being out of power, now back in it, has a more clear-headed vision. Another could be Trump is Trump. He's not any different. What is different is he now has an administration that appears to have, though it has warring factions within it, things that might be more clearly defined as a vision.
I think it's the latter. I think it's pretty clear the latter. Not that Trump, I don't think, has changed some. I do think he is sharper on some issues that he was ambivalent on in 2017, and he's more combative in certain aspects, and that drives him to do certain things that he probably wouldn't have done the first time around. But I think it is largely that this time, and you saw this in the lead up to the election, and in December and January, you finally had a team. He finally put a team around him that was clearly designed to execute some of the core tenets that he had talked about. Which you see as they unfold, like the flurry of executive orders that he's issued on all these ranges of subjects, would not have seen in 2017. But he has people around him to remind him that, hey, this is what you said you were going to do. This is what you ran on. This is what you promised, etc. This is what we're going to do. Or on tariffs, right? He has turned the knob to 11 on that issue in a way he didn't the first time around, because he has people around him that are true believers, or at the very least understand that that's what won him the election in certain parts of the country, and said, all right, this is what you're going to do.
And I think that you mentioned tariffs. I think that is the very thing that, prompted me to ask you that question, because Donald Trump has turned the knob on tariffs to an 11 in rhetoric for certain. And I'm not implying he has not done things. He certainly has. But I still do not have a clear answer from the man. What exactly is your love affair with tariffs? Is it supposed to bring in prosperity? Is it supposed to reinvent American business, manufacturing? Is it a political tool to get concessions out of enemies or maybe even allies? And it seems like he has multiple. It's almost like a multiple personality disorder, depending on which day is which reason we're supposed to go after tariffs. Whereas you have also within the administration individuals who, though I largely disagree with them, I think in good faith believe tariffs are a net good for this specific reason.
Yeah, well, tariffs is certainly an issue that the organization I work with, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, has definitely spoken up about, has an opinion about. We have
as
plenty
that
of
name
stuff
would
out there.
imply.
Yes, we have plenty out there from people like Ian Murray and Ryan Young to speak on this. So I won't try to say too much of their stuff. But as you're saying, we've seen lots of different explanations, and like explanations that don't fit together as to why these tariffs are being put in place. But similar to what we've been speaking about, there's warring factions even within MAGA and within the administration. We see some members, I think the Treasury Secretary, I don't know exactly what his thoughts are, but he seems to be less pro-tariff than we see from other people like Navarro. So we see these kinds of fractures, even maybe more muted on the tariff issue, but definitely that's there as well. As to what the MAGA base thinks about it, I don't have the numbers on that, so I won't speak to that. But I think that it's not as passionate as an issue as you see for something like Epstein or Israel, but that's something that there's division there too. It will be interesting to see how that plays out in a post-Trump presidency.
Along that line, in Congress, there's another reason that Trump seems to be doing it is partly as a revenue raiser to partially counteract some of the tax cuts that came through, and have that be part of the tax mix that we got going now, especially with the cuts that came in, combined with investment that he's more or less demanded from especially South Korea, Japan, and the EU, the biggest ones who could afford to invest in us over the coming years. And there seems to be a pushback to try to do a rebate or refund that I think Hawley, who's probably one of the purest populists variants of MAGA in Congress for good and ill. He seems to be playing up that angle to try to do that. It sounds like the bill's not going to go anywhere, but he's clearly trying to wave a flag on that, especially as they try to collaborate to try to figure out a reconciliation 2.0. You also mentioned internal cohesion for MAGA, and you could also say the same thing for the center left holding together with the progressives, holding together with, in certain cases, the far left, depending on part of the country, for their coalition. Wall Street Journal, I believe, just or Pew, one of the two, in the last week or so, has specifically put out that the Democrats are at their lowest approval, depending on marker, in at least 20 years, if not in some cases as far back as the Cold War, when they started tracking approval of parties overall. But they're still winning in the generic congressional ballot. Whether that pans out, given all the redistricting stuff of late, we will see. But point is, they're cohering in opposition, despite the fact that they're all beating up on each other and they're going against their establishment in a way they hadn't done. And I'm still expecting a lot of primaries come next year, especially amongst some of the oldsters on their side. But they'll still probably unite into a general election. Not unlike what happened with the Republicans during the Tea Party wave in 2010, at least in individual states in 2012, and even as late as 2014 when it was still under that name before it got more or less subsumed by MAGA. So I would say that there's going to be an internal coherence, probably for both sides, to at least elect DNR, even if they may not like DNR at this juncture, just to get through to the other side of the midterm, and then the explosion happens, one side or the other, or the other, I should say, where I think Vance is probably heir apparent. He seems to be doing even better in polls as time's gone on, but that's still not a guarantee he'll still win. Life throws curveballs for any politician. So it seems like there still might be that, but it still could be a bloody primary. But the Democrats, I definitely think, will have that issue for to contend with come 2028, especially with Harris not running for governor. And it seems like everybody's trying to play nice publicly, but there's very much a likely free-for-all that's going to happen on their side, with a reckoning depending on how bloody their primaries are come next year. And or how they do with gubernatorial races or the redistricting fights, and whether they can even get back Congress, or at least the House, if not the Senate. As well.
I'm of the opinion, generally speaking, there are obvious exceptions, that inter-party fights tend to make the parties stronger over time. In other words, this ability to sort of work through these differences at a primary level, to work it up to where you can, in theory, have national appeal. Obviously can have the opposite effects. You can have enough infighting or bad blood that there's not enough enthusiasm to support national candidates. But what I do find interesting is, so part of the fracturing, I guess, as we're calling it, of the right, is not so much, most of the time when people talk about fracturing, what they mean is these things are so bad that the party itself will be out of power for an indefinite period of time because they just can't work through differences. I think it's more the coalition building is such that it's unlikely they're going to be carved off and necessarily go to the other party. But what I find fascinating is the degree to which individual interest groups, if you will, within MAGA behave or speak as if they speak for MAGA. I mean, you mentioned Senator Josh Hawley. And I don't mean he would be heir apparent, but rather he has a certain lock. You're right, the purest sort of populist, bring our jobs back kind of. And Josh Hawley's a very intelligent senator. I disagree with him on a good many things, but I think he's very well spoken and very intelligent. And I think he represents one wing of what is essentially a broader coalition. And I think that what is unique about Trump is his lack of ideological clarity, or his lack of maybe I shouldn't say vision, because I think he does a decent job painting vision, but maybe not the specifics. I think creates this kind of framework where you can have warring groups within the administration who can probably all make pretty legitimate claims that they speak for MAGA, even though they're diametrically opposed to another coalition speaking for MAGA. I don't know that makes the right healthier necessarily. I don't know that leads to the kind of eventual synthesis that can reform and form a coalition like the Reagan coalition, or everybody knows I'm not a fan of the MAGA or Trump coalition, but from a purely political perspective, something you can win an election with, it has been effective. I just don't know if it can continue to morph into something else that's effective if the only thing holding it together is literally an individual's personality.
Yeah, I mean, it's a unique situation where it's not a set of issues per se that kind of unites MAGA. The number one uniting factor is Trump himself. And so you look to the next election, and we've seen this already. As I said before, he's very happy to throw around his weight. And we've seen that he always wants to be involved in a primary, endorse his person. And that often works. But you don't see the numbers that you see for Trump. That person usually gets enough to win the primary, but they're going to get lower numbers than Trump did in that district. And so it'll be interesting to see when we come to 2028. As already been mentioned, J.D. Vance, heir apparent, but even Trump has been kind of gleefully holding back that kind of endorsement. He's kind of pitted Vance and Rubio against each other in mentioning potential successors. And so, I mean, you could see definitely a world where in 2028, the MAGA movement kind of splinters off into the Vance faction and the Rubio faction and maybe the Hawley faction, the DeSantis faction that prefer Trump to DeSantis, but wants DeSantis next. It's kind of hard to say exactly where this goes in 2028. Trump probably make an endorsement. I suspect he will. But will that be enough to bring the fullness of the MAGA movement, or is that where it ends? Does it end after this cycle?
Along that line, I was just thinking of a very good example of where there seems to be some significant dissent and has caused some, for good and ill, dissension within the administration that came out wondering what the heck was going on. And I think there was some stuff with Ukraine with Elbridge Colby in the Pentagon collaborating with Hegseth and shutting down a certain supply of, I think it was a weapon a few weeks ago that got countermanded by Trump publicly. And it took a few days to figure out what the heck was going on because it seemed like the left hand wasn't talking to the right. And it didn't, because there was that internal dissension on that question. And that was within one of the biggest departments that we're dealing with of the government at this point. So I would say that is a clear example of that in action, that who knows where that's going to go. Just on the foreign policy side, we mentioned Iran before and stuff with Israel. Ukraine's another example where that could easily blow up with some of the foreign policy parts of the coalition that have been contradictory, especially as Trump seems to be warming up towards Ukraine as he's gotten more upset with Putin over the last few months. So that's a clear example of illustrating what you were talking about there, Josh.
Yeah, and I'm sharing a comment, by the way, from Apocalypse Trucker. I love these YouTube titles. I'm tempted to always try to deduce what their politics might be from the title, but that's probably a bad idea. Trump went from an outsider to just a Bush light with some better policies. I don't know that I completely sign on to that notion, but it's an interesting one, and I do wonder the degree to which any carving off, say, of Trump support might have been that he was perceived often as the antidote to Bush, right? This guy is not here to get us into another pointless war. He's a Republican that we can trust because he's not going to start another pointless war. And then the attack on Iran, I was honestly surprised the degree to which individuals who, largely from the left, tried immediately to equate the bombing of Iran with here we go again. Like we're invading Iraq or Afghanistan as if we had boots in the ground on Iran. But I think that was kind of a wake-up call for a lot of individuals that, and to be fair, that's nothing even remotely akin to nation building, to a Bush response after 9/11. But I think there were a lot of individuals who presumed Trump was more a non-interventionist than he was. And I honestly think he's more a, not to butcher the term, but a Jacksonian, right? A you do not offend our honor. We will stick up for ourselves. And we will, we don't want to get involved in wars, and we're not interested in foreign alliances or complicated international trade deals and protecting it militarily. But by God, if you harm us, we're going to punch back. And so I think this is probably in line with who Trump really was all along. But what say you, gentlemen?
Very quick, I think the closest equivalent, and you could maybe point to another example in the other party, and this was explicitly said by Mark Levin and a couple others, he seems to be going for the he seems to be making a Reaganite play of gunboat diplomacy, one big thing, and then we're out on the proviso that you don't do what we were upset about again, and we will go away. Not unlike what Clinton did a couple times himself. So there is precedent in both parties, but Reagan probably is the better comparison on that, I would say.
I agree with that, and I wish there was a term for what I'm about to describe, and perhaps I'll invent one someday. You mentioned Clinton. Trump's foreign policy has always struck me as very, very akin to mid-1990s sort of general public foreign policy, in that you watch CNN or you watch Fox News or you watch the BBC, and it shows you some international broadcast of some horror happening halfway around the world, and emotionally you get charged up and you want to do something. That has always seemed to me that Trump's guiding mantra is what is the latest thing that was in front of me? Was it bad? Let's go do something about it, right? You saw this in the first term when he bombed Syria because he watched CNN and they showed Syrian children getting gassed by Assad, and he said, all right, we should do something about that. He went and he bombed them and he stopped it, and that was it. Similar dynamic with Iran in that he saw that Israel had destroyed their air defenses and said, oh, now we can go do something. He's not ideological on foreign policy in a way that some of the people around him are. And I think that'll be interesting to see come 2028, because in the primary, we'll have to actually have those debates.
I think it was Obama who said, like when he was running for president in 2008, he said, I became a blank canvas that people could project onto me, like what their hopes were. And in some ways, you see something similar with Donald Trump. Like, there definitely was a vision in terms of like immigration and trade deals and things like that. But a lot of it was like more vague, and a lot of it was what he stood in opposition to. And I think a lot of people had this idea in their mind of like what Make America Great Again looked like in specific details that were not actually presented by Trump. And I think a lot of people projected that onto him. And I think it's a lot easier to criticize NAFTA or NATO or this or that when you're not actually having to put policies forward. And when you do, you kind of expose yourself to people who like don't like those things, and it contradicts how they saw you in their head, basically.
As a young conservative, I often made fun of Obama's hope and change, right? It's so vague. And to be fair, all political visions and expressions have to be ridiculously vague. But hopefully they have standing behind it a Reagan-type figure who can at least flesh out some sort of a clear vision to get everybody on board. And I think Make America Great Again suffers from, it's not as bad as Hope and Change. Maybe it's a little bit clearer, but it does seem to suffer from that. I occasionally, back when I was a bit more active on the social media website formerly known as Twitter, when Trump would tweet, every once in a while he would just tweet in all caps, Make America Great Again, ! And I would typically respond, I will get right on that, sir. Because it's just sort of like, it makes you feel good, but it doesn't actually mean anything. And so you get to imbue it with whatever meaning you thought it should have. So let me ask that. I want to pivot the conversation just a bit, because I think we could, if we're looking at potential fractures on the right or within the Trump coalition, The two big ones appear to be foreign policy, Iran, Israel. Maybe you could say Ukraine, but I don't know. I still can't figure out what the what the clear objective there is, or if he's going to change his mind, tomorrow about what he said last. The other one, and I hesitate to bring it up, but I kind of have to, is Jeffrey Epstein, in that it's such a tabloid story. I don't know about you gentlemen, but I have the podcasts and the news that I consume. I was thoroughly, it was interesting to me. They all seem to have this exact same reaction, which was, we were not paying as much attention to this story as maybe we should have been. And they did not mean by that they thought that there was some deep conspiracy, but rather they were all caught a little off guard the degree to which a fraction of MAGA did not accept Donald Trump's approach of there's nothing to see here, folks, and seemed to believe that Trump would be this beacon of light that was finally going to get to the bottom of something truly crooked. And I think there are varying levels of which people were pretending that they knew what this thing was, but that it was Trump himself. He was the man. He was the one not tainted by the establishment and the only one powerful enough to actually get to the bottom of this. And so when he caved, when he decided, no, we're not going to release any additional information, that was just a bridge too far, right? It's not necessarily that they're saying, well, I think he's involved in sex with underage women, but rather some powerful forces are even too powerful for Donald Trump to work against. And I will just say that I it's unfortunate because I think we have sometimes in our minds these extremely simplistic visions of what the MacGuffin, what the thing is we're trying to get to, right? We keep referring to this thing called the files, the Jeffrey Epstein files. I've yet to have anybody definitively define for what the heck are those things? Like, do they exist? Is it? And I think sometimes it was later in the show, so you can be forgiven if you hadn't seen it. But in The Office, there's this scene where Ryan, the temp, tells Dwight, "I know about your diabolical plan to get Jim Halpert." And Dwight just straight up like, "What are you talking about? That's ridiculous. I don't have a diabolical." And as he's talking, Ryan holds up a report with this cover on it that literally says, "My Diabolical Plan" by Dwight Schrute. I think that's what a lot of people are thinking with these Epstein files, is that for some odd reason, Jeffrey Epstein put together, like with pictures and DNA evidence, here's everybody I helped, aided and abetted. I don't think those things exist, but I do think there's probably a storehouse of information out there that could incriminate some people. It's probably complicated, and it could maybe incriminate Trump. Again, let me be clear. I don't think he was involved in sex with underage women, but rather he had a chummy relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, and it doesn't look good. And so I guess this isn't so much a question. I guess I'm wondering, because all the voices I was listening to said we were not following this story closely enough because we thought it was a bunch of tabloid nonsense. Why get bogged down in this when we got real politics to talk about? And now they're sort of saying maybe we should have. Maybe this went deeper in the MAGA movement and psyche than we realized and represented more of a fraction than we thought it might. And maybe we haven't seen the end of this. This might be the beginning of those who were the deepest in the conspiratorial weeds finally starting to say maybe Trump is not our guy.
That was where I was going, combined with the Iran situation, and a lot of people. I am not part of this necessarily.
Right.
I am saying there is a small but substantial subset, and a lot of them only started getting political, and they're the ones that I'm thinking might fracture most outside of any of the economic and other pecuniary interest. Those who who often associate Epstein with Israel for various and sundry reasons, like Ehud Barak being an old friend of his, the old prime minister from Israel 25 years ago when they tried to get the Clinton deal, right towards the end of his presidency. That's a big part and parcel of where they might flake off, and that's where I'm coming at with the 5 to 10% that are getting peeved and or might walk.
Yeah.
I think I might be able to help you out a little bit, Josh. I think one of the reasons you might have been missing this story is because you're too much of an intellectual. The Jeffrey Epstein story is like the best like celebrity gossip type National Enquirer. You know, I mean, I don't know if you saw, there's a documentary not that long ago about Jerry Springer, and it just blew my mind. I'd never watched Jerry Springer, but just like the just dumb things that are put on television, and you realize like that's what a lot of people are gravitate towards. And this story like just sucks people in like no other. You know, it's the juiciest gossip around. Also, there's a contingent of people where this is like the pedophilia, sex trafficking is their number one issue. And there's a small but significant number of people who have tied this like, you know, like the entire world is somehow part of this like cabal, you know, relating to pedophilia. And I think a lot of people, if they saw Trump like seemingly suppressing that, like that was a breaking point for some people.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize here, because all four of you gentlemen are one, you know, I respect you all deeply. I regret we even have to have these conversations, because it sounds like we're lunatics when we talk about these individuals who believe the world is run by you know, the powerful and the elite all form this sort of cabal that protect each other so that they can participate in underage or pedophilia, sex trafficking. But that's real. There's a shocking, obviously not the majority, but a shocking, substantial minority that seems to have this as their guiding principle. Now, to be fair, I think if any one of us believed that was true, it probably would be the number one issue that animates us. It's just kind of insane the degree to which that does animate a very large chunk of the right.
Yeah, and these are also people that tend to be more of the online, especially on Twitter/X. So it's hard to gauge exactly to what extent of the MAGA movement is as upset about this, but definitely the ones that are active online really are causing a stir on this.
I agree with all that. My initial reaction, because I was surprised as well at how violent the opposition to Trump got in some corners of the right when he said he wasn't going to release the files, or he wasn't going to, you know, there's nothing to see here. My initial reaction, I think the reason that so many people are shocked by that reaction is that it shows determinatively whether or not you agree that the issue is important, that there is a portion of the MAGA movement that comes to Trump by way of the issue first, personality second, as opposed to most of what you see, especially in the online world where this is more prevalent, is that, you know, large influencers and large personalities and stuff attach themselves to Trump because he wins or because he's got a strong personality, and they'll let Trump fill in the details of what they actually believe later. And when Trump changes his beliefs, they change theirs as well, right? In this issue, in this particular, like Dan Beningo, I think that's how you pronounce his last name. Bongino.
You're not the first person to butcher that name.
Yeah. You know, he's one example of somebody who came to Trump in large part because of this, but he is, you know, fan of Trump because of this issue. And when you know, back in 2015 when Pizzagate happened, he was part of the charge on that one. So he's clearly comes at this from a principled perspective, and he represents a wing of the movement that does that, and that are fans of Trump because of the issue, not because Trump is Trump and they fill this in, you know, they backfill this, as opposed to somebody like Charlie Kirk, who has attached himself to Trump because he's Trump, was, you know, pro releasing the files until Trump said something, and has now, you know, backtracked and said, well, hold on, maybe we should wait, you know, such and such. So it's an interesting reveal there that there are portions of this movement, of this coalition, that put the issue first and will not bend the knee to Trump on this issue.
That's I mean, I'm grateful that they have those principles. It's just a weird hill to die on. But
I think he also made this worse for himself because he had Pam Bondi going out there, Attorney General going out there very early in the administration, going on all the news channels, well, some of the news channels, like Fox, about how they were going to release all of this, and they did the big photo op with the big folder that turned out to be just repackaging of what little had been put out there already. To do all of that and be promising all of this all over the news channels, and then turn around and say, actually, turns out there's nothing. It's like, they're not going to believe that. People are not going to believe that, and honestly, like, they shouldn't believe that.
So I'm curious about this. If you gentlemen could help me out here, because Dan Bongino has always been a loose screw, as I can tell. It doesn't surprise me that he went head over heels for this, and that this is kind of his issue. What's up with Pam Bondi? Like, I'm not saying I was a huge fan of hers, but I never really thought of her as like the conspiratorial type. Did she just get too caught up in what a political opportunistic moment? Because it seemed like she was way too much, way in over her skis, claiming, yeah, the files are on my desk, putting these and for those who don't know, yeah, it was ridiculous. They put together documents for, I guess, what we would probably call friendly media outlets, right? It was just individuals invited to the Attorney General put together some documents. All these photo ops are walking out with these binders. And I think it says something to the effect of like the most transparent administration in history underneath that. And it was all a crock. It was all just recycled information. Nothing new was in there. That just seemed like something I would expect of a Dan Bongino, but not of a Pam Bondi. Like, any insights here as to why she might have went off the deep end and did all that?
I've got some connections in parts of official Republican world that she was formerly the Attorney General of Florida. She was there from 2010 to 2018. She was part of the Tea Party wave. That came on with Rubio winning the Senate seat and Rick Scott, now senator, then just elected governor, taking control of the state government. And she always tried to endear herself with the base. And then when Trump came along, she endeared herself to Trump. She was part of the defense team with the impeachment at the time. Both of them, I believe, back in 2019 and then in 2021. And she ingratiated herself during the 4 years of his exile down in Palm Beach with, if not American First Policy Institute, some stuff with the Republican Party, official Republican Party in Florida, and a few others, up to and including the soon-to-be RNC chair, incoming now that Whatley's running for Senate in North Carolina. And so she kind of developed an apparatchik approach to things where she would say things, and she was trying to develop a role as a fixer. And I think she thought that this would be a type of thing that could go along with that. And yeah, she got way ahead of her skis. And some of the people that she worked with as she was coming up over the last 15 years in Florida are not considered very reputable by certain other people high up in the Republican world, but they have Trump's ear. Yeah. And that's kind of how they've been able to latch in and sometimes test the Peter principle on something like this, where she's been pretty aggressive in other things that seem to have suited parts of the coalition just fine, and she's taking advantage of that. The obverse of this is Gabbard, who kind of had egg on her face from the Iran scandal, or scandal, from trying to tamp down everything with Iran over the last couple months. She turns around and comes out with all this stuff with the Russian collusion situation, and now she's throwing that to Bondi, and Bondi was semi-blindsided but seems to be going along with it to try to change the subject. And so I would also throw it in where people seem to always rise and fall within Trump world. There's very few people that tend to coast. Yeah. And I would also say that she's kind of in a doghouse looking situation right now, but she does well with this Obama, Brennan, Comey, Russian collusion thing, inquiry that they're trying to get going. She might get out of the doghouse.
And Christopher, I think you're absolutely right that there's, they don't coast. Very few do. But I just meant it seemed like it was such an unforced error on Pam Bondi's part. Like, where did she think this was going to end? If this file doesn't exist, or she hadn't cleared it with her boss, what was the end game? Whereas someone like Tulsi Gabbard is, who I do not like her views, especially foreign policy wise. I nonetheless, I think she's a far more capable operative as far as communication goes, and it would be more shocking if someone like a Tulsi Gabbard made such an unforced error. I think that was just sort of where I was going with this. Like, why do all that?
I don't really think there's a much more complex reason than she knows she works for Trump. She assumed incorrectly, it would seem, that the best way to serve Trump and to manage this part of the coalition was to turn the knob up to 11, like really push this, see if you can't get this out of the way sooner in the administration than later, with the hopes that, the big public press release and handing out the binders and saying, I've got the files on my desk at home, that saying all these things would try to would feed the enthusiasm for it from that part of the right and satiate them. And it turns out that, those the wrong bets, because when you then turn around and say there's nothing there, or you have the president, your boss countermanding you very publicly in very confusing ways for 2 weeks straight, right? That just looks bad. But I think this was just a case of she got over her skis trying to manage the celebrity part of working for Trump, as opposed to just being attorney general.
I long for the day when celebrity in politics is just not a term we would ever need to equate with each other.
I think it was Joe. I was going to mention this before when you're talking about the scandalousness and salaciousness coming into politics with Trump, but obviously you could say Gary Hart was the example, then Clinton and everything else since then. I think it was Jonah Goldberg who mentioned, and I'm not the biggest fan of Jonah at this point, but he did say something that did stick with me about, with Trump, there has been a rise in pornographication in an older sense of the term entering the body politic, especially on the right wing, that seems to have risen to this crescendo, and Epstein is the pinnacle of that, but he's definitely not the only aspect of that.
Mm-hmm.
To where it's kind of funny when now Health Human Services Secretary Robert Kennedy Jr. had that sex scandal with Olivia Nuzzi last year. It's like, oh, this is a traditional sex scandal. Like, where has this been? There was some of that commentary on X Twitter, and everybody got a good guffaw out of that for a couple days. And just like, this is the most typical one. We almost, I hate to say it, want to beckon that back, but that's kind of where we're at now. Where that's the most normal thing we heard about during the election last year.
Yeah, it reminds me, Christopher, of in the gosh, it wasn't that long ago. It feels like a lifetime ago, though, when Rod Blagojevich, former governor of Illinois, was going through all his scandals. Someone was saying, thank God that I finally have a scandal I can explain to my children. This is just normal corruption. And we've gotten so far beyond that now. We could just give me something that's a normal sex scandal, at least make it PG-13 for me. Well, gentlemen, we're coming close to the end of the hour here. So and if you have any burning thoughts, I certainly want you to have a chance to get them out there. But I wanted to also kind of go around the horn asking this question. Saving Elephants, among other things, is decidedly of the opinion that, character is destiny. I'm not trying to sound too much like David French here, but that character is destiny. He wasn't the only one to say that. That in effect, while the political brinksmanship can move up or down, back and forth, things can be good or bad, that ultimately the corruption or the lack of integrity, say, within a movement will ultimately harm it. Now, I think a movement can also go on indefinitely if its only counterpoint is equally corrupt or harmful or compromised, if you will. And so I'm just wondering, I was kind of mentioning this earlier in the conversation, like, while there may be fractures in MAGA, it also seems to me that the left is fully capable of losing elections for the indefinite future. And so I'm asking, as a sort of unfair prediction of the future, what do you think, maybe not a specific, but sort of a range of possibilities, what do you think the future holds for us? Do you think this eventually gets settled to where this sort of binary, yes, that guy's a scumbag, but your guy's even more scumbag, will eventually dissipate, and we'll get back to the business of maybe deluding ourselves into think we're actually electing good people? Or do you think this goes on in perpetuity? What do you think the future holds for us?
I think this is shot in the dark, and it would also be helped if, ironically, it was Brett Stevens who kind of, I think he writes for the Times now. He used to be with Wall Street Journal. He said Republicans should hope that Democrats throw put Mondani in power, and that we have that briar patch to deal with for electoral contrast with seeing New York die. And I think that could help Republicans even into 2026 and potentially 2028, since they have a 4-year term that would overlap with the next presidential. I would say that if there is we haven't had a 2-loss cycle since 2008 into 2012. It's been alternating one in and out for over a decade now, or going on a decade now. So if there is a loss by, it seems like Democrats are starting to try to double down on extreme, especially in the biggest city. You can say there's a contrast with what's going on in New Jersey and Virginia, but New York's clearly got the most eyeballs in.
Yeah, they're not making the headlines in New Jersey and Virginia.
They're wagging. It's the tail wagging the dog there, and that seems to be the case with a lot of the left. Even though you've got some counter people trying to do the abundance agenda and whatnot, that are generally more on the center left and trying to get governance to be good in blue states again. And even Newsom's trying to make a feint towards that. Whether it actually works out, time will tell. I think not, but actually, and I get some of that from people that actually work at CEI with Destry, who've spoken on this, as well as other people that comment in the labor space. But I think that if the Democrats in particular lose, there might be an even harder reckoning than we had now, not unlike what you might have had in the 80s after they lost 3 in a row. Because it was 3 out of 4, but it was to the same guy, and whoever wins for the Republicans in 28 is going to try to at least ostensibly try to carry the Trump banner. And if they should win, I think that forces some sort of rejiggering on the left. I don't know to where. It could go further left. It could go towards the center again, like they ostensibly tried to do with Clinton and the DLC. There's a few different ways it could go. But if you lose 2 presidential elections in a row now in this age of Trump, and you get almost a decade riding in the saddle there, I think that forces some sort of change on the left. On the right wing, if we lose, and especially if it's close, I think there will be a civil war of some kind. I just don't know how it would end. And if the fever would break, depending on if you consider it a good or bad thing, that will be its own mess to deal with on the right wing. So I know that's an unclear answer. It's more definitive for the Democrats than the Republicans, but that's where I'm at.
I think for 2018, the Republican Party is going to really need to face its identity crisis. As we've seen in the past several years, even under Bush, it was really kind of the Reagan Party still, and now it's the Trump Party. And as we were discussing already, the kind of Trump focus of MAGA is Trump. And in 2028, we now have to figure out, without a Trump as the nominee, what does that even look like? And it's possible that the Republican Party can come around to something very clearly, whether it's a J.D. Vance or Rubio, Nikki Haley, or DeSantis, any of these people, or somebody that we haven't even really considered yet. It's possible that can happen. It's possible it could just splinter things and the party doesn't really know what it stands for anymore. The term conservative doesn't really mean today what everyone assumed it meant 8 years ago. It's kind of an unclear term at this point. The term right wing is even more unclear than even conservative is at this point. So we have to face all those things. On the left, they're facing similar issues of how crazy can we get and how crazy can we tolerate. People talk about maybe even AOC because she'll be old enough to run in 2028. I don't know if that's going to happen. I have no idea. She might be looking for Senate or something like that. But I would also say for any Republicans who are looking forward to something like someone like an AOC being the nominee, I would say careful what you wish for. The Democrats were so eager to run against Trump in 2016 because he was unelectable. So I'd say be careful with that.
I think we talk a lot about like the problems on the right, but like others have mentioned, the bar is incredibly low. I think the left at this point is suicidally stupid in terms of their electoral strategy. Let's demonize white people, which are close to 2/3 of the population, men, which are 50% of the population. You get all these groups that are negatively portrayed by the Democrats right now, and it's a huge majority of the country. They're just giving it to the Republicans in that sense. They come across as smug, annoying, elitist. And the thing is, it's such a cult-like fervor, a fanaticism, that I think, I can't remember if it was Christopher Destry who said, it's like you have to meet these purity standards in a sense. I'm also very interested in like the abundance liberalism, like Ezra Klein, to see if that could kind of revive that DLC, type mentality in the Democrats. But I don't think it's even possible to do that right now because they're so fanatical and purist in the type of person that, is like could even make it through that gauntlet. You have to have so many different purity pledges. I think, as long as Democrats hold that kind of mentality, they're just giving a gift basket to Republicans every election.
And I would tie into that could very well play into the census stuff that comes up in 2030, especially should they lose in 28, combined with part of the reason the abundance agenda is being talked about is they see the census numbers, they see the number, they see the writing on the wall. And so that is something that 2030 is as important as 28 for them, for being able to the Rust Belt won't be needed to win with its swing states going forward, because they could get to just the 270 if they include Omaha plus Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, even if they lose northern Maine. They will lose that guaranteed already. It's just going to be icing on the cake if more people keep coming to the South and the Sun Belt, fleeing California or any of the other blue states. And that's part of the abundance agenda's push implicitly, is to try to counteract that and show that you can afford to stay here again. And they might not be able to get that done, as he's talking about, because they're so stuck on stupid.
I don't have much to add to what the other fellows have said. My response to your question, I guess, is more in the weeds, in that in times of political realignment, where the traditional coalitions sort of break down and they start to shift and with new things, the party that steals the base on realignment is going to have an advantage in the first 2, 3, 4 cycles, and it is incumbent on the party that's behind the 8 ball to catch up. Trump stole a base on realignment in 2016 with the tariff stuff. As you see today, the Republican Party has become the party of working class politics, for good and ill, because Trump saw that moment in 2016 and seized upon it. Dems have yet to adequately accept that the moment has changed, that the alignments has changed. They haven't quite leaned into that yet. Once they do, I think we'll get back to a equilibrium that makes sense politically and also raises the level of our politics. I don't think we are doomed to my guy's nasty, but your guy's is nastier, so I'm going to vote for him, forever. I don't think we've ever been doomed to that. But it'll take Dems recognizing that their coalition is shifting, and you're going to have to find different politics to sort of win at the margins, because they haven't quite figured that out yet.
It's such an interesting time we live in, is it not? It just seems like everything is a question mark about the future. Everything's up. Everything always has been a question mark.
Pretty sure that's an old Chinese curse.
Yeah. May you live in interesting times. But it can also be fun, you know. At least the tabloids contain Jeffrey Epstein type articles that can entertain us all, I suppose. Well, with that, I want to thank everybody that hung with us, that was watching. Thank you for those who were commenting, and thank you especially to Christopher, Scott, Ryan, Destry. Always profit from you guys' insights, and I know it's hard to predict the future. It's hard to say what will come, but I do appreciate you adding some clarity to this very murky subject. So with that, I will call it a night, and we will see you guys next time.